You know what I'm not bumping up against here? There's not a table right here behind me. Why was there ever a table right here behind me? Tradition. Did we use that table to serve the Lord's Supper? Yeah. Well, no, technically no. We used it to hold the Lord's Supper. It's a table. It's not a holy table. It's not a special table. It's a table. And we put the Lord's Supper on it. Do you know there are places that never had one of those tables? There are places that had those tables and it didn't say "this do in remembrance of me" across the front of it. There are people who had those tables who put a cloth over the plates. I remember, I've told you, some of y'all may not have heard it if you weren't around then, but I've told you about a congregation in Florida that nearly came to a split. Florida, hot. They didn't have air conditioning. They would open windows. Flies would come in. So they started putting a cloth over the plates. They finally got air conditioning, closed the windows, didn't have a fly problem anymore. But they'd been using that same white cloth over the plates for so long that when the men went forward to get ready to serve, two men, one at each end, would pick it up and they would fold it very particularly and lay it on the corner of the table. When they were done serving, they'd put the trays back up there, unfold it, put it back very ceremoniously. Did that for years. Somebody, after they closed the windows and turned on the air conditioning, some time went by and somebody said, "Why are we still using the cloth? We don't have a fly problem anymore." And the congregation almost split over taking that cloth away from the table, not using it anymore. Why? Tradition. It didn't mean anything until somebody started making it mean something.
What I think about the main point is between God and the devil. That's the big competition. And put the pieces in the middle.
Well,
Almost like
and what we're talking about here is generally speaking about good people who see God as the authority, who want to do what God says to do, who are being faithful to Him, and when it comes to something where God doesn't say, do it with all these details in this exact way, can you do it in a different way? Yes. And it's okay. As long as you're still doing what God said to do. You do it a little differently? Okay. I've been places where things look very different than the way we do our assemblies, typically here in the United States. And all it should make you do is say, this is different. Is everybody still doing what God said to do? Even though we didn't sit in pews in a church. We're sitting around a table in somebody's house. And when it came time to serve the Lord's Supper, they didn't have the little cups to pass around. And they poured some into some cups and regular cups and passed them around. And when the bread came by, it wasn't already broken in little square. It was, so you break it off yourself. And nobody got up and stood up and held the gold-colored plate and prayed. Somebody just sat at the table and prayed and just pushed it around. It looked different. But it had the same elements of doing what God said to do. So, of course, we can do things in different ways as long as we're following what God said to do. We need to be careful about the idea of our traditions. And if y'all were all here a few years ago, we did a quarter study on tradition and truth. And we looked at a number of these kinds of things. Truth has to be followed. Traditions that go along with truth don't have to be followed. And we need to understand the church is the church, because of who they submit to, because of the standard that they follow, not because of whether our extra tradition lines up exactly the same. Lord willing, next week we'll continue this study. Thank you. Hey, Bob.